Kenny Omega. So obviously everyone's talking still about Kenny Omega, especially considering that tonight is the debut appearance of the new AEW World Champion Kenny Omega on Impact Wrestling on Access TV. We're going to get all the fallout from the special Winter is Coming special edition of Dynamite last week. Of course, as Dynamite went off the air last week, what did we have? We had Kenny Omega winning the World Championship thanks to Impact Wrestling Executive Vice President Don Callis. They then quickly got out of Daily's place as fast as possible, and then when they were confronted by Alex Marvez, AEW broadcaster, who asked them what is going on, Don Callis said, "You'll find out Tuesday night on Impact Wrestling on Access TV," confirming a working relationship that's now in place between AEW and Impact Wrestling. Now, at the moment, we don't know the finer details when it comes to what this relationship consists of. There have been so many conflicting reports about what this relationship is or isn't when it comes to AEW and Impact Wrestling going forward. But considering that it's tonight, considering we don't have to wait much longer, considering that we're still in this phase right now where we can fantasy book, we can think about what potentially could be, as opposed to in a couple of hours' time know what actually is going to be. So let's talk about potentially, should Kenny Omega actually have a match inside of an Impact Wrestling ring, which right now we don't know if he will going forward or not, or whether it's just going to be an appearance tonight on Impact and that's it. Should that happen, should that Kenny Omega have a match inside of an Impact Wrestling ring, or several matches inside of an Impact Wrestling ring, what kind of opponents should Kenny Omega be facing on the Impact Wrestling roster? Now, I've come up with a few names. It's not an exhaustive list. It's just some names that I think potentially we could see Kenny Omega face should this working relationship be expanded, should this working relationship become a bigger thing, and we have Kenny Omega competing regularly, or at least on a few occasions, in Impact Wrestling. What opponents could Kenny Omega be facing in the future? So let's have a look at some of the names that I've put together. First, we're going to go with Rich Swann. Now, I've mentioned this before. We did a video last week when I spoke about potential matches we could see in Impact Wrestling with this, or with this AEW Impact Wrestling relationship. Potential matches with one wrestler representing Impact, the other wrestler representing AEW. What kind of matches could we see going forward should that be the case? And one of the matches, I think the first match that I mentioned, was Kenny Omega versus Rich Swann. Now, why did I talk about that? Why did I pick that match? There are other opponents for Kenny Omega to face in Impact Wrestling. I've named them and we're going to talk about them in this video. Why Rich Swann? Well, most importantly, Rich Swann is the Impact World Champion. Don Callis has been hyping this up and kind of been teasing this. Dave Meltzer actually said this on the Wrestling Observer Radio. Then it was retweeted, or at least hinted at by Don Callis. Champion versus champion. Promotion versus promotion. Now, what Don Callis has been hyping up and hinting at on social media is he's playing the Bobby Heenan role to Kenny Omega's Nick Bockwinkel. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, in the 1970s, Bobby Heenan managed the AWA World Champion Nick Bockwinkel in an interpromotional match against the then WWF Champion Bob Backlund. Now, the match ended, I believe, in a double countout, no contest, whatever screwy finish, but it was big at the time because it was really one of the first times you had two world champions from separate promotions facing off in a big match, and it hadn't really been seen before, and we haven't seen it many times in pro wrestling since, to be honest. Now, I know in WWE you have the world champion of SmackDown face the world champion of Raw. They're in the same company, they're under the same promotion. It's very rare. It's very rare to have the world champion of one company face the world champion of another company, especially two larger companies like AEW and Impact. Now, are AEW and Impact the two biggest companies in the world? Of course they're not. WWE is still number one. AEW, it's even discussed if AEW is actually second or not, because New Japan is so big as well. Definitely in North America, they're number two, AEW. Where does Impact fit into that? Well, Impact's certainly smaller than New Japan. They absolutely are. So it's not often, nevertheless, that we see two world champions of separate promotions facing off. This, to me, would probably be the biggest match they could do with Kenny Omega. And I know some people might say, nah, that's not the case. You've got bigger and better opponents that he could face in Impact Wrestling. We'll touch on them in a second. But the nature of having the world champion of one company face the world champion of another company is such a big deal, and it doesn't happen so often. It would be truly historic. Now, you do have to talk about Rich Swann in this role. I've spoken about him in the other video that we did here on the channel, talking about champion versus champion. Is Rich Swann the right man for that role? That is a very difficult thing to answer, and I struggled to answer it then, and I struggle to answer it now, quite frankly. Rich Swann is the world champion right now. So is he the right man for that position? Well, he's the world champion. He's the de facto person that should go into that role. Is Rich Swann versus Kenny Omega the biggest match you can do? Probably not. Probably not. But I'm not really sure it's Rich Swann's real fault I think, first of all, Rich Swann has stepped up massively to the plate. During his feud with Eric Young, in capturing and chasing the Impact World Championship, he stepped up into that main event level. Prior to feuding with Eric Young, a lot of people would have said, Rich Swann can't be a world champion. He's not world championship material. I think he's still winning people over right now to see if he's truly world champion material. So it would kind of be a leap of faith, I suppose, to see, can he hang with Kenny Omega? Can he carry a big match like a world champion versus world champion match? For me, the jury is still out. I don't know if he's really proven himself to be at that level of being a world champion. Only time will tell. Obviously, that's down to him, but it's also down to the booking of Impact. Can they create a legitimate new main eventer in which Rich Swann? We'll have to wait and see on that one. Only time will tell. Nevertheless, when it comes to is the Rich Swann the right person for the role, again, this is what I think is really important here, is that this is kind of the problem with Impact Wrestling right now is, and I've stated this a few times, that they don't have that top guy in Impact Wrestling. They don't have the person that is the top of the card. They don't have that person that is literally the top, the guy, the centerpiece, the franchise player, whatever terminology you want to use. They don't have that top tier babyface in the company right now. This is why I said that they might look into people like bringing back James Storm because he would fit that role. And people might say, well, James Storm's too old. The issue is that they don't have that person that's up there right now. That is the problem. So Rich Swann is kind of by proxy, he has to go into that role. So Rich Swann would face Kenny Omega if they wanted to do a world champion versus world champion match. Now, depending on when they would do this, maybe things would change. It looks like Rich Swann is going to face Moose. I think at Hard to Kill, maybe it would be Moose that faced Kenny Omega for the World Championship. Chris Bay faces Rich Swann Saturday at Final Resolution. Maybe Chris Bay would face Kenny Omega. Both names we've actually got down. We'll talk about them more in a second. But it's a difficult one. Is it a big match? I think by proxy of having a world champion versus world champion, it's a big match. Is it the biggest match they could do when in terms of Kenny Omega having opponents in Impact? I don't think so. But again, when it comes to Rich Swann, he will have his opportunity to prove people wrong, and we'll see if he can do it. Well, what about Chris Bay? Now, Chris Bay, of course, challenges Rich Swann at Final Resolution on Saturday, and there is this potential, I suppose, that Chris Bay could be the world champion. So you could be looking at a scenario, like I said, with Rich Swann, where you've got world champion versus world champion. Now, in my opinion, I don't think Chris Bay is going to win at Final Resolution on Saturday. Of course, Final Resolution has already been taped. It was part of the Marathon TV tapings a couple of weeks ago, whenever they were. All of the days bleed into each other at the moment. I don't think Chris Bay will be the world champion. I don't think he will defeat Rich Swann. I think absolutely, potentially, in time, he can be a world champion in Impact Wrestling. I'm a huge advocate and a huge fan of Chris Bay. I think his work is stellar. I think he has the look. I think he has the personality. Maybe needs to tweak the promos and improve on the promos, but that's the thing that I think most pro wrestlers nowadays need to improve on and need to learn and develop is the promo skills. I think most people in pro wrestling nowadays are unbelievable athletes and the things they can do in the ring is incredible. Chris Bay is no exception. Is Chris Bay versus Kenny Omega the biggest match that Impact and AEW could do if they were going to do cross-promotion? Maybe not. But again, who really is that top guy in Impact Wrestling right now? That spot is open. That spot is absolutely open. Can Chris Bay, finesse his way into that position? Why not? In a couple of years' time, I could absolutely see someone like Chris Bay being the top babyface in Impact Wrestling. He has all the tools to do that. So maybe this Chris Bay and Kenny Omega match might actually serve as a couple of purposes. Maybe it's the match that Chris Bay actually does need to really go up to that next level, to go up to that next stage in Impact Wrestling. Maybe having a feud against Kenny Omega or just a one-off interpromotional match against Kenny Omega is exactly what he needs. Now, Chris Bay wouldn't even need to win the match. Having a match alone against Kenny Omega would be enough to elevate him in Impact Wrestling, establish him as a credible, legit main eventer, and then going forward, he can be that guy in Impact Wrestling. He can be that world champion. He can be that one to strap the company on his back and ride it to the moon. So Chris Bay versus Kenny Omega, I think fundamentally, let's look at the nuts and bolts of the situation here, would just be technically a fantastic match. I mean, Kenny Omega is one of the best pro wrestlers in the world, and Chris Bay is incredibly talented in the ring. Why wouldn't this be a fantastic match? If you can do the match, why wouldn't you do it? So I think the possibility of a Chris Bay versus Kenny Omega match is really intriguing to me. One of the most intriguing, I think, matches are here on the list. So Chris Bay versus Kenny Omega, I think, would serve, again, a couple of purposes. Elevate Chris Bay to the next level. I think Chris Bay's money in the future is as a top babyface. in Impact Wrestling. I think he will get over so much as a heel that you have to turn him babyface eventually. And maybe Kenny Omega, as an opponent, serves those multiple purposes. Maybe it does elevate him to the main event level, and maybe it does serve as a purpose to actually turn him into a babyface. Who knows? Now, speaking of young and up-and-coming talent, what about Ace Austin? Now, Ace Austin, I actually missed him out of the AEW versus Impact matches video that I did last week, and a lot of people said, why did you miss out Ace Austin? To be honest, it was just a case of there were so many matches I could have done, and instead I went for Jericho versus Chris Bay in those match types. Could have easily gone for Chris Jericho versus Ace Austin, and a lot of people said they want to see Jericho versus Ace Austin. Me too. I absolutely want to see Jericho versus Ace Austin. I think their chemistry would be fantastic. You know for a fact Jericho would be all over it. He would love to elevate a young talent like Ace Austin. It's interesting right now when it comes to Ace Austin and Impact Wrestling, because obviously coming into Bound for Glory we had the 4-way tag team match between Ace Austin, Madman Fulton, the Machine Guns, the North, and the Good Brothers. Coming out of Bound for Glory, we haven't seen much of Ace Austin and Madman Fulton that much, which seems bizarre to me because Ace Austin is such a next level talent for me. I mentioned the potential of someone like Chris Bay just a second ago, and I think Ace Austin is right there too. Now, I mentioned I think Chris Bay's money eventually is as a big babyface in Impact Wrestling. I think Ace Austin's money is as the top heel in Impact Wrestling. Yes, people will say, is he big enough? All that kind of stuff. That stuff is so outdated. That whole idea that to be a main event talent you need to be, 6'3" and 300 pounds or 280 pounds is so outdated. It's insane. I think Ace Austin is just so much money. He's so much money in the bank waiting to happen. And once again, like I said with Chris Bay, I think a Kenny Omega match, if he was to have a couple of opponents in Impact Wrestling, why not have it with a younger talent like Ace Austin? Why not think, look, we are kind of struggling for big stars at the top of the card. We are kind of struggling to really elevate talent to the next level, to really establish that top tier world champion that is going to carry the company. Why not use this relationship with AEW to make a star? Why not use this relationship with AEW to elevate someone like an Ace Austin right to the top of the card and actually establish a new star and actually carry Impact Wrestling for a couple of years? Why not use Kenny Omega in that position? So again, I think Ace Austin would work perfectly in that match. I suppose the only issue with Kenny Omega as an opponent for Ace Austin would be these are two heels right now. Kenny Omega is definitely the cleaner in AEW, and Ace Austin is definitely a heel. He plays the heel role, the sort of smarky heel in Impact Wrestling to perfection, I think. So the issue then would be is how interesting is a heel versus heel match. I would probably argue with that what could be interesting about it is they're just absolutely fantastic in the ring. The match alone would be fantastic. And also you could kind of probably make Ace Austin the babyface depending on the location. If they had an Ace Austin versus Kenny Omega match inside of an Impact Wrestling ring, you can kind of make Ace Austin the babyface by proxy because he's the hometown guy in the sense that he's with Impact Wrestling. He's the hometown boy. He's the guy fighting on his home turf. You could kind of get around it doing that, I suppose. Nevertheless, Kenny Omega, Ace Austin, I would be all over seeing that match. Now, in comparison to that, what about the veteran talent in someone like Eric Young? Eric Young versus Kenny Omega, if you'd have said that match 12 months ago, you'd have said, are you crazy? Because 12 months ago, Eric Young was on the WWE roster and he was doing nothing apart from maybe sitting at home and occasionally appearing on main event where he would lose in about 5 seconds. Fast forward to now, the year that Eric Young has had since re-signing with Impact Wrestling back in July has just been insane. It's been absolutely insane. Right, for a period of time, maybe not right now, for a period of time from when he made his re-debut, his return to Impact at Slammiversary till that Bound for Glory pay-per-view, nobody could touch Eric Young. They just couldn't. Nobody was on his level. He was the best heel in the company. He was doing the best work in the company. He was doing the best promos, the best character work, having the best matches, telling the best stories. Eric Young just hit it out of the park this year. Eric Young re-established himself as a guy that can be in the main event. He said this to Vince McMahon whilst he was with WWE. He said, Raw is a 3-hour show, and you can't find a place for Eric Young. Eric Young can do it all, and he really can. He can do comedy. He can be the babyface. He can be the heel. He can be the psycho heel. He can be the comedy heel. He can be the comedy babyface. He can do it all. He can do it all, and he's solid in the ring as well. So when you have someone like Kenny Omega, who could be perceived as an outsider coming in to Impact Wrestling from AEW, why not have essentially a TNA original defending the honor and the legacy of Impact Wrestling. I think that would be very interesting as well. Bear in mind as well, Kenny Omega is Canadian as well. The connection between Kenny Omega and Don Callis is that they're both from Winnipeg. Now, Eric Young himself isn't from Winnipeg, but he's certainly Canadian. He was even part of Team Canada all those years back in TNA. So maybe they could do something like that. Maybe they can play off of, you're not the top Canadian in Impact Wrestling. Who do you think you are, coming in from an outside company and thinking you own the place? This should be all about me in Impact Wrestling. This is my home. This is my place that I helped elevate over the last year, since I've returned. So I would be interested in that. Would it be as good of a match as Kenny Omega, say, versus Ace Austin or Chris Bay or Rich Swann? Maybe not. But fundamentally, in terms of telling a story, it might even be a better match than that. Maybe the spots wouldn't be as high-flying, but maybe the story would be better, and maybe the story being told in terms of promos and vignettes and backstage segments and all that kind of stuff, maybe that would be better. Plus, you also have the outside interference of Joe Doring, and then you've got Don Callis on the outside. There's a lot of variables there, which I think would make this match very compelling and very interesting. Now, speaking of very interesting, what about if Kenny Omega faced the TNA World Heavyweight Champion himself, Moose? Now, Moose is very crucial to this because, as I mentioned earlier on about potentially facing Rich Swann, we could have a situation where it's champion versus champion, AEW World Champion versus Impact World Champion. Where does Moose fit into this? Well, as I mentioned, we don't know anything in terms of confirmation right now, but for me, if I'm trying to read the lay of the land, as it were, when it comes to future storylines and future matches in Impact Wrestling, for me, I think we're headed to Rich Swann versus Moose at Hard to Kill. They've been teasing it for months at this point. They teased it right after Bound for Glory, with Moose actually confronting Rich Swann backstage when he was talking to the Rascals. Moose has been feuding with Rich Swann's best friend as well in Willie Mack. Last week, when it was Chris Bay versus Willie Mack, Moose gets involved, comes out, spears Willie Mack, and then Rich Swann comes to the rescue. They're kind of sowing the seeds about what eventually is going to happen, which for me is Rich Swann versus Moose at Hard to Kill. Personally, I think that might be the pay-per-view that Rich Swann drops the World Championship. To me, Moose is being groomed to be the next top heel in Impact Wrestling. As I said, in the absence of a top babyface, they've kind of had to go with top heels in Impact so far. I think Eric Young did fantastic for the short period of time he had the championship. But I think it's Moose's position at this point. He's been with the company for 4 years? Going into 2021, it'll be 5 years. His contract is coming up in February. I expect him to re-sign. To me, he seems like an Impact guy, and to me, he seems featured in when it comes to that World Championship picture, and I expect him to have quite actually a lengthy run with the World Championship in Impact Wrestling. If that is the case, if he's both the Impact World Champion and the TNA World Heavyweight Champion, actually maybe unifies, puts those two championships together, that would put him in line perfectly to have a match with Kenny Omega. Should he have some matches in Impact Wrestling? Should we actually get the AEW World Champion versus the Impact World Champion? I think maybe, I mentioned about maybe the biggest match you could possibly do out of the talent that's on the Impact roster right now. Maybe that person would actually be Moose. And I know in terms of being a draw, maybe Moose isn't the top guy, but I think he's the guy right now that seems the most ready to have that match. Is Moose the best in the ring out of all the names we've put out there today? Probably not. Is he the best character out of all those names we put out there today? Probably not. But it feels like he's the momentum and he is the guy that's ready to be elevated to the next level. And maybe most importantly, from an Impact point of view, he's the one that the office, I think, is most behind at this point. He's the guy that I think is probably going to stay around. And as I mentioned, I think he's going to win the World Championship. So Moose seems to me like a guy that probably would face Kenny Omega should Kenny Omega do matches in Impact Wrestling. Again, like with Ace Austin, I suppose the problem there is that you've got two heel world champions. How do you do that? How do you carry that forward? Again, I suppose the only way to overcome that is that the fact that Moose is competing inside of an Impact ring almost essentially makes him the babyface as he's trying to defend the company that he would be the world champion of. I think maybe that would be the way of going over it. We'd have to wait and see. I'd be fascinated to see what that match looks like. I think there'd be a complete contrasting of styles. But I mentioned about who is the top person in the company. I suppose not in that they don't have the top babyface. I would suppose maybe the top heel in the company right now is Moose. So that would make most sense that he seems the guy ready to step into that main event position out of all the names that we're going to mention today. Now, There has been rumours about the Good Brothers when it comes to this AEW Impact Wrestling relationship, that the Good Brothers are scheduled to face the Young Bucks inside of an AEW ring. It's been rumoured that the Good Brothers could be heading to AEW to have a match against the Young Bucks in return for the favour of having Kenny Omega appear on Impact Wrestling on Access TV tonight. We'll of course have to wait and see if that is the case or not. Nevertheless, if Kenny Omega did come in to Impact Wrestling, maybe it would make the most sense to face one of the Good Brothers. Maybe it would actually be Carl Anderson. Considering that both people were in the Bullet Club, of course, all three of these wrestlers were in the Bullet Club together, maybe it would make sense for separate leaders to face off against each other. That could be an interesting scenario that they have. So I think maybe out of all of these names, we mentioned Rich Swann, Chris Bay, Ace Austin, Eric Young, Moose, maybe the most likely match is actually Kenny Omega versus Carl Anderson. Maybe that's the match there that actually does make the most sense because of their history in New Japan and because of their history as leaders of the Bullet Club. Maybe that is the direction that they will be going in. So potentially, Kenny Omega versus Carl Anderson, or Doc Gallows for that matter, could be the match that we see if Kenny Omega does indeed have a match in Impact Wrestling. And what about Ethan Page? Now, Ethan Page is such a fascinating situation right now when it comes to Impact because, of course, we don't know the situation about his contract. We don't know if Ethan Page is going to re-sign with Impact Wrestling or not. We know that his contract is up at the end of the year. We know that he hasn't re-signed a deal with Impact Wrestling as of yet. So, what's going to happen with Ethan Page? Well, what a carrot to make him re-sign if you re-sign your Impact Wrestling deal, you're going to go one-on-one with Kenny Omega inside of an Impact Wrestling ring. Now, there's obviously also been a lot of discussion that Ethan Page, if he doesn't re-sign with Impact, he's going to go to AEW. Perhaps this whole relationship that is being worked out between Impact Wrestling and AEW is a perfect way to facilitate Ethan Page's move to AEW, but also represent Impact in matches on the AEW side of things on TNT. It could lead to a match against Kenny Omega on his previous home turf in Impact Wrestling. To me, that does seem like a possibility. I've been saying for a while, Ethan Page, for me, is a future world champion, especially in Impact Wrestling. That's why I would like him to stay at least a year. I'd like him to do the breakup angle with Josh Alexander of the North, and then I'd like for him to pursue the world championship. Talking about top heels in the company, Ethan Page can not only be a top heel, but he can be a world champion and dominate in there. He's just that good. Maybe, as I mentioned with the likes of Chris Bay and Ace Austin, maybe that's how you elevate Ethan Page to the next level into a main eventer in Impact Wrestling. You have the match against Kenny Omega, and he goes, you know what, I don't need to be a tag team guy anymore, I can be a singles. It's a possibility. I think all of these names we've mentioned today absolutely could be a possibility. So it would be interesting to see these matches happen should Kenny Omega actually have a match inside of an Impact Wrestling ring. But of course, as always, this is just one man's opinion. What are your thoughts on Kenny Omega's potential opponents should he have a match inside of an Impact Wrestling ring? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll do my best to respond and reply to all of your comments. Really enjoy interacting with you guys and chatting about Impact Wrestling here on the channel. If you have enjoyed this video, please do smash a like on the like button. It really does help us out here on YouTube. Go up the rankings and get into people's recommendation feeds if they haven't seen our videos previously. But most importantly, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to Wrestle News 365. You can do that by clicking the bottom right hand corner of the screen right now. Or if you wait a few seconds, there'll be a subscribe button at the end of this video along with another video for you to watch. Thank you very much for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. And I'll speak to you again very, very soon.
Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.